Hi, if you like the video, please remember to subscribe. Hi, my name's Rob from robnonphoto.com, and the photos you've just been watching at the beginning of the video are HDR images that I've taken, not with my 600d, but with my 350d and with my Rebel XT a few years ago. And I kind of realised that, you know, I mean, I enjoyed taking HDRs with my 350d Rebel XT Canon SLR. But now I've got my new 600d, I thought I'd really need to do a new video kind of explaining how you can set up your camera to take HDRs and some of the process that you go through to create a HDR, a high dynamic range image. So the first thing, you know, why do we need to take HDRs? You know, well, we don't need to, but why do we take them? Well, one of the problems with the sensors in our cameras is that they can't see as a broader range of light as we can with our eyes. So you probably notice this quite a lot when you're out with your camera. You might see a beautiful scene, like a landscape scene, and you take the picture, but because the sun was particularly bright on that day, that maybe the skies comes out nice and with lots of detail in the clouds, and you can see the blue and everything, but then the ground might be a little bit too dark. Or it might be the other way around, in the fact that it's a beautiful day, you take a photograph and the ground looks great, the trees, lots of detail, but the sky has washed out and gone really pale and you can't see the colours and the detail in the clouds like we can with our eyes. And this is where high dynamic range images come in, HDRs, because what it is, it's a technique whereby we can normally take a number of photographs of the same scene at different exposures. So one that's exposed correctly for the sky, one that's exposed correctly for the ground, and normally one that's in the middle. And then we squash them together using some software often referred to as a tone mapping software, and that then produces an image where there's lots of detail, not only in the sky but also in the ground as well, so in the highlights, in the bright bits, and in the shadows as well. So it can be really interesting. And I remember when I took the first created the first HDRs that I had done with my Canon, actually no, it was probably with my old Fujifilm S5700 camera several years ago, and the detail and the look of the photographs will really blow you away. It can be quite amazing. You think, did I take this photograph? Did I do that? And yeah, it can be. Yeah, it really is. It is great fun and adds another string to your bow. Now, you've probably seen lots of HDR photographs knocking around the internet on Flickr, on lots of different places, that are probably a little bit overdone, and this is the biggest trap we can fall into with HDR. We create images that have too much detail, and the colors are probably too saturated, and you end up with something that almost looks like it could have been created inside a computer. It looks very rendered. It looks like computer generated imagery. It looks like CGI. Now, if that's the look you're going for, happy days. But often you find that the best HDR images are the ones that you don't know. You look at them and you just think, wow, that's a beautiful photograph of a beautiful scene. Although lots of things like your mobile phones and your compact cameras and even things like your digital SLRs now will often have a HDR kind of that they'll do a faux HDR, a fake HDR. You can apply it in post-processing and things like that. It's not quite the same as doing it the proper way, and it can be a little bit confusing to do. So you tend to use HDR in situations where there's lots of brightness in a scene and lots of darkness, but you still want to keep the details between the two. So a classic thing is a very, very sunny day, perhaps, where there's lots of detail in the sky with clouds, and there's lots of detail in the ground, and normally you can only have one or the other. You know, if you expose for the ground, then the sky looks a bit washed out. If you expose for the sky, then the ground looks a little bit dark. Also, I think HDRs are great for increasing the textures and the details in a photograph. So completely different from landscapes, things like interiors, pictures of textiles, bark, wood, anything that, well, almost any photograph actually, you can bring out lots of details. Portraits of people you can as well. They can be a little bit tricky. But it really is very good. And again, the piece of advice that I'll probably keep repeating throughout this video is less is more. Don't worry about toning it back a little bit. But the other side of it really is go for it. Produces the images you really enjoy, and over time you'll become happy with the style that you particularly like to do. So the kind of accepted way that you produce a HDR is you'll use your camera and you'll capture 3 images, normally one after the other, one dark, one in the middle, and then one bright. So you've exposed for the highlights, which are the the bright bits, you've exposed for the shadows, the dark bits, and you've got one in the middle. And then you feed that into a program such as Photomatics or HDR Effects Pro. That squashes them together and comes out with this image, which you can then fiddle with the settings and then further edit it as well. I like to use HDR, not as much as I used to, but I in the UK as well, we tend to have lots of dull days, lots of grey days, where the sky is just like this massive grey softbox, and you end up with very little detail in things because there's not that much shadow. And HDR is great on days like that because you can bring out all this detail in stuff, and it's great for that. One other thing as well is if you're shooting raw, or well, you can even do it with JPEGs actually. Lots of programs such as Photomatics will produce a HDR like image, especially with a raw file, out of just one photograph, because with a raw file, if you shoot in raw, there's a lot more data in it than there is with a JPEG, a lot more detail in the shadows and the brightness, and then the highlights, sorry, so that you can bring that back. But for the purposes of this tutorial about the 600D Rebel T3i, we're going to be concentrating on just taking 3 photographs. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sort of talk you through it sort of face to face as we are now, and then what I'm going to do is flip the camera around so that you can see what I'm doing with the settings on the camera, so you can probably maybe pause the video and have a go yourself, and then at the end I'll put some photographs that I've taken with the 600D T3i, some HDR, so you can kind of again get a feel of it. Before we go any further though, I'd also like to add that you don't need to buy any special software to produce HDRs, to produce high dynamic range images. If you've got a Google Plus account and you upload your photographs to it, or you use Google's Picasa, which I do, and you can set it to upload and sync your photographs. What Google will do is if it sees 3 photographs that are the same but are at different exposures, it will automatically produce a HDR. And if you set your Picasa account to sync, what it will then do is when you upload your photographs, you back them up to the cloud, it then downloads a HDR for you and sticks it in the same folder that you can look at. And in fact, the photos you'll see at the end of this particular tutorial, they're actually all automatically produced by Google, which is pretty cool. I've done a bit more editing. I've made black and white ones and changed the contrast in a little bit, but that's how easy it is. So you didn't even have to lay out for something like Photomatics. If you're heavily into HDR, I recommend you do, because it's a very powerful program. There's lots of information on the web on how to use it, and in fact with the latest version of Photomatics, there's lots and lots of different presets that you can click on that really get you there in terms of different types of photos, different types of HDRs, from very, very strong vivid looks to more natural to monochrome black and whites. So you don't really have to fiddle with the sliders that much at all. So let's say we want to take a HDR photo with our Canon 600D Rebel T3i. You know, kind of where do we start? Where do we want to start? Well, for me, I guess what I tend to do is I'll probably be shooting with something like an 18 to 55, because we're going to be taking one photograph after the other as quickly as we can. We really want to try and avoid camera shake, and I'm going to talk about handheld shooting to start off with. And you find that can be a lot easier with a wider angle lens, because any effect of the camera moving is greatly reduced, whereas if you're using a telephoto lens and zooming in on something, any little camera shakes can be greatly amplified. So I tend to be using something like 18 to 55. Image stabilization will be on, and in fact you're probably better off to start off with just remember the wife checklist. And if you always start with this checklist before you start shooting, so the first thing to do, turn my camera on, and the wife checklist is W for white balance, so just check that I'm on auto, or some people prefer to shoot in a fixed white balance, say maybe a shade or a cloudy white balance. But I'll stick mine on auto. I is for ISO, and I'm going to set my ISO to auto. We know that the high ISO performance of the 600D T3i is very, very good, and it helps us to keep shots with no camera shaking, even if we've kind of slipped a little bit and we haven't noticed our shutter speed getting long, so that's good. F is for focus, so I'm on auto focus on the side, and I'm just going to check I'm on one shot, so I've done that. And the E is for exposure, and for the purposes of our HDR, we're going to be shooting in aperture priority mode. And I'm going to be shooting at something like probably f8. Now you want to be doing that because in a HDR photo, often what we're doing is we're emphasizing detail. And in order to do that, we want most of the image as sharp as possible. So we don't really want to be shooting wide open, because if we shoot wide open at 3.5, 2.8, 1.8, etc., that really makes the depth of field smaller, so you could end up with situations where the background might be blurred, and then when you put it through the software, that can then create sort of funny grainy look. So if you can, go for a middling sort of aperture like f8, and then probably most of the scene will be in focus, and you'll get a really good looking image. Now, as far as quality go, lots of people recommend you shoot in RAW. Because that's the highest quality you can get out of your camera in terms of the amount of data in that particular file. However, I mean, call me an old, I don't know, fuddy duddy, but I don't particularly like shooting in RAW because I think it slows the camera down a little bit. It definitely slows your post-processing down a lot, because a RAW file can be quite flat, lacking in contrast, lacking in saturation, so you've got to bring it back up to that style. And I think that with modern sensors and the modern software that's inside the cameras, JPEGs are fine, so I would say just shoot at the highest quality JPEG setting in your camera that way. Now, the next thing we're going to be doing as well is we're going to be shooting in continuous shooting. So set your camera to continuous shooting, because again, we want to shoot one photograph after the other as fast as we can, and we want to do that because we want to minimize the amount that our camera is going to move, and also subjects might be moving in front of us. If it's a landscape, things like trees waving, the clouds coming across the scene, and anything that moves makes it more difficult for the HDR software to create a really nice image. You can end up with ghosting and all sorts of stuff. And then the really important thing that you then do is we then turn on auto exposure bracketing. So with the Canons, that you press the menu button and then just find it's the second one from the left, and you look at it, it says Expo Comp /AEB, and you press set to go into it, and then you dial the command dial. And what you want to do is you want to set those little brackets all the way out, so it's plus or minus. I think it goes from 0 to 2, so that's 2 stops brighter and 2 stops darker, and you just set that in. And so now what we do, we're pretty much set up to take our photograph. So then you would just compose your photo in the normal way, but don't forget the basics. We're really going to try and use photographer's luck, so we're going to take lots of sets of 3. We're going to take landscape style, we're going to take portrait style, get down low, get up high. There may be things that are coming in and out of the scene or moving that you haven't spotted, so it's very important to take a number of shots. And it can take a little bit of practice to get the 3 shots in, but basically you're just going to be going and then taking your finger off, and then if you then go in and look at the photos, you'll see a normal one, a darker one, and then a brighter one. Now, to start off with, you might find sometimes you only press 2 and then have to do the third one, or you might find you might do too many and then you've got to do it again. But what you've got to remember is for every 3 shots, the camera will then take a darker one, a brighter one, and one that's just right. But you'll find with a little bit of practice, you'll just be able to go and you'll have your 3 shots. And have a look at them, and then just work that scene. You do portrait, do landscape, zoom in a little bit, zoom out a little bit. Really take advantage of photographer's luck to get those images into the camera, and take lots of different scenes, because often with the HDRs you might not actually spot the best subject for a particular HDR while you're actually there. It might be something else that comes out very, very nice. And as I say, HDR can work very well for nice wide vistas, landscape shots, right down to detailed macro shots as well. You're getting very close to something. Now, that's for kind of handheld stuff on fairly during the day when there's lots of light around. There may be situations though when there's not that much light around. You might be doing a HDR at night. It might be very, very cloudy, or you might specifically think, right, I want to use low ISOs to reduce the noise, where you're going to be using a using a tripod to lock the camera down so the camera doesn't move. But when you are doing things like that, if you do put your ISO down to say 100 or 200 and then bracket from there, just remember that anything that's moving can cause a problem. And it can be some really mundane things like blades of grass moving, a flag on a flagpole flapping around, trees sort of swaying. You'd be amazed how much, even on a fairly calm day, how quickly clouds move across the sky, people wandering around. So that's why it's very, very important that when you are shooting on a tripod and perhaps using a lower ISO, so your shutter speed's a little bit longer, that you really have a good look around, see if anything's coming into the frame, and then just take some more sets if you have to. Photomatics and HDR software is very good at getting rid of moving things, people, cars and all this sort of stuff, but if you can give it 3 clean images to start off with, that's really, really good. Now, throughout this kind of tutorial I've talked about how you're going to use 3 images, but when you get into it you may want to go up to 5, and when you do that is you can't use auto exposure bracketing with the Canon. You've got to then go into manual mode and then go down sort of maybe 5 stops, and then up to 3 under, then a normal one, then over 3, and then over 5. But you'll probably find, with these sensors in these cameras, they capture an enormous amount of detail, and 3 shots, 1 shot, two stops underexposed, 2 stops overexposed, and 1 in the middle will be more than enough and create nice images for you to then upload to either Google or put them into Photomatics. Now, one of the things I would say is, if you really fancy having a go at this, go to Photomatics, download the trial version, give it a go. There's even parts of Photoshop, I believe, that you can do HDRs. Or as I say, download Google's Picasa for free, link it up to your Google Plus account, turn on the little sync thing that's on the folder so it uploads your photos, and then you'll get HDRs coming round there. Now, when you've created your HDR with Photomatics or Google, I will do separate videos about that, just remember that's really only the start of the process. You're then going to do some more editing as well. You're probably going to crop the images, you're probably going to adjust the brightness, the contrast, the saturation, but always remember, often with HDR photos, less is more. Try and be subtle with them. And you'll find over time you'll develop your style with your HDRs, because it's very easy at the beginning to just go balls out and create images that are really wild and wacky, and you'll love them, but you'll find over time you tend to tone it down a bit. Alright, so what we'll do now is we'll turn the camera around so you can see me sort of changing these settings, and then we'll have some example photos at the end. Thanks. Okay, so here we go. Here's my Canon EOS 600d Rebel T3i dSLR. So what we'll do is we will go through and check out the kind of settings you're going to want to probably put into your camera if you want to take a 3 exposure HDR image that you're going to then upload to Google or Photomatics, HDR Pro, the HDR tone mapping software of your particular choice. So the first thing we'll go through is a nice little checklist that you can use for any time, and it's called the wife checklist. So with the wife checklist you just go turn your camera on. So W is for white balance, so press the white balance button. I tend to use auto white balance. Let's see if you can get that in focus. I tend to use auto white balance. You may want to sort of stick with a fixed one, such as shade tends to warm things up, but I like white balance. ISO is on the top on the camera, so it's that button there. Now just press that one. Now again, we're going handheld shooting to start off with, so I would recommend just stick with auto, because the high ISO performance of the 600D is exceptional, and you end up with nice looking photos as well. F is for focus, so make sure you've got the autofocus button on your lens, image stabilizer on as well, and then we can press the AF button here on the right of the camera and just check we're on one shot. We don't want the camera refocusing on something as we're taking the photo, trying to take 3 photographs. And E is for exposure. So for HDRs, we're going to be going to aperture priority. As you can see, we've got AB. We can just turn the thing, and then I'm going to be shooting at f8 because I want nice depth of field so that I can bring out all the detail possible in my my particular photograph. Now, one of the things I talked about to start off with again is you may want to change the quality you shoot at. I'm not afraid to admit it, I'm a JPEG shooter. I think the quality of JPEGs is fine. I like the small file sizes, and as all the photos we tend to do get shared on the internet as JPEGs, I don't think there's anything wrong with JPEGs at all. However, if you want to, you may find that you get improved detail in your HDRs if you shoot in RAW, but I don't. So once we've put all that in there, the next thing we want to do is really is the magic button, which is really to put in the auto exposure bracketing. So you press the menu button up here, and then on the second menu across, you probably see me going to that, we can see this one at the top, exposure compensation AEB. So we press the set button and we're into here. Basically what this is telling us is whether we're going to shoot darker or brighter, and then what we can do is here with the command dial on the top, we just roll that like that to the right, and as you can see, these little lines here are changing. So what's happening there is we're telling the camera we want to take 3 shots, one that's underexposed by 2 stops, one that's just right, and one that's overexposed by 2. Now, one of the things you can do, actually, I didn't mention to start off with, is you can also, once you put your bracketing in, you can also say, well, actually, I want my normal shot to be 2 stops underexposed anyway. Let's say it was an incredibly bright scene. Or you could say, well, I want my normal shot to be two stops overexposed, my underexposed one to be just right, my overexposed one to be 4 stops overexposed. Now this is quite advanced mucking around now, but so I would say just go keep it in the middle, press set, and we're good to go. And then the final thing we want to do is we want to go into our bracketing button and make sure we're on continuous shooting. Press set, and then we're good to go, because what will happen now is when we take a photograph and go let me point the camera out of in another bit of the room. Right, so you probably heard the camera fire 3 times. So if we now look at this in the review, this is a review just out of over, so we can see there we go, start there. So we've got a very dark image. Oh no, we haven't. We've got a normal image, a very dark image, so we can see lots of detail in the house that's outside, and then we've got a very bright image where we can then see the detail in the sofa that's at the back of the room. And that's really it as far as capturing HDRs go. It's nice and simple. Remember, when you're finished, to take your camera out of continuous shooting mode. And I think if you turn your camera off, let me just check something. I think if you turn it off, I don't think it remembers what you've been doing. No, yeah, that's a really good point, actually. I should have mentioned that in the main video as well. Is if the camera, if you turn the camera off, or I think if it turns off automatically, automatic exposure bracketing turns off as well. So you've got to go back into the menu, and roll that back out, and that will do that way. So you can now go off and take some HDRs with your Canon 600d T3i. Now, one little thing I'll mention as well, you probably noticed that on your 600d T3i, the very last menu item is called My Menu, and with My Menu you can actually add your own things. So you can probably see here that what I've added to My Menu is exposure compensation, mirror lockup, and format, and they're probably the 3 most common things, menu changes I change with my camera, because if I want to do a HDR, I need to change the automatic exposure bracketing setting. If I'm using a tripod for things like macro work, where I don't want the camera to move at all, I can enable mirror lockup. And then format is obviously when I've taken some pictures. So there's a little hint there. Go into my menu, put exposure bracketing at the top. I know it's at the top of the other one, but it's nice to keep everything in the same place. And you maybe will speed up the speed of your workflow a little bit. So there we go. There's HDR settings on the 600D Rebel T3i. If you've got any questions, remember you can always email me, scalespeeder@gmail.com. I'll show a few example photos afterwards. Now, and remember, these photos are ones that have been taken on the 600D T3i, and then Google, using via Google Plus and Picasa, has then created automatic HDRs and then downloaded them, and it's as simple as that. And I've just done a little bit more editing. My name's Rob from roblandphoto.com. Thanks for watching.